When two police officers arrested her, they had no idea that they would meet her again, this time in a courtroom, as the judge who would decide their fate. She was alone in the park, reading a book and enjoying the peace and quiet, but to them she looked suspicious. It wasn't just a stop on her journey through life. It was a moment that made her change everything, from fighting for herself to fighting for everyone who had gone through what she had. I was sitting on a bench in the park. It was a beautiful day, the sun was shining, and I was enjoying the silence that the moment offered. The book in my hands was the only thing distracting me from my daily worries and stress. Children were playing nearby, people were running, the sounds of their footsteps and laughter mingling in harmony with nature. I was alone, but it was fine. I didn't need company to feel at peace. These moments of solitude always helped me recharge my batteries. Suddenly, I was distracted by the sharp screech of brakes. I looked up and saw a police car stop right next to the bench. Two officers got out of the car, their posture rigid, their eyes piercing. I knew immediately that this was not just a routine stop. "Ma'am, can we talk?" one of the officers asked, approaching me. His voice was cold, and his manner of speaking left no room for refusal. My reaction was automatic. I looked up at him, trying to understand what was going on. I was alone, sitting with a book, not bothering anyone. I took a step back and, keeping my cool, replied, "How can I help you? Would you mind answering a few questions?" He didn't back down. There was no sympathy or curiosity in his voice. It sounded more like an order. Feeling the tension rising inside me, I asked, "What's going on?" "I'm just reading." And then, as if that weren't enough, another officer stepped forward. His expression was commanding. "We've received a report of suspicious activity in this part of the park. What are you doing?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was surprised by their suspicion. How could sitting on a bench with a book be suspicious? I took the book out of my hands and showed it to them, even though I knew it wouldn't help in their eyes. "I'm just reading." I tried to remain calm, but inside I was outraged that I was being asked such trivial questions. How could I be suspicious because of a book in my hands? "We need to see your ID," one of them said, his tone unapologetic. I felt my heart beating faster, but I tried not to show it. I had lived in this city, walked in these parks, and never before had I felt so wrong. Was it because I was dark-skinned? Maybe I just didn't fit their standards? Maybe I was too convenient for their prejudices? "I don't understand what's going on," I said calmly, but my words were already heavy as stones. "Why are you asking me for my documents? I'm not breaking the law." The officer didn't stop. He became even more insistent. "It's standard procedure. Don't worry. Just show me your documents." My hand nervously reached for my bag. I wanted it all to end. I took out my ID and handed it to him. He not only looked at my information, but also pronounced my name as if there was some hidden danger in it. "Camilla Johnson? Is that right?" "Well, Ms. Johnson, tell me, why are you here alone?" "I'm just in the park," I replied again, but this time my voice broke slightly. How was it possible that a woman sitting on a bench could provoke such a reaction? How had I become suspicious just because of the color of my skin? Without waiting for my answer, the officer turned to the other one. "Look at her behavior. She's not cooperating. This isn't the first time." My reaction was immediate. I couldn't stay silent any longer. "I won't answer any questions until you tell me what I'm suspected of. This isn't just procedure, it's harassment." They paused for a second, but then it got even worse. Before I knew it, one of the officers grabbed me by the arm. His grip was so strong that I felt my body tense up in fear. "You're resisting," he shouted. His words echoed in my head, but I couldn't understand why this was happening to me. "I'm not resisting," I shouted. "This is impossible." And at that moment, when his hand wrapped around my wrists and I felt the cold metal handcuffs, I knew I couldn't let this happen. I know the law. I know my rights. And I will fight to the end, even if it's the hardest test of my life. The police station seemed like some kind of ruthless machine to me. Every step in this institution was like another blow to my dignity. I was led through corridors where the light barely dispelled the thick shadows creeping across the walls. I felt small and powerless. This place was not for people. It was for those whom the system had already condemned, even without a real trial. Every movement of the officers was precise, almost mechanical. I was led to a cell, where I sat down on a cold bench. My hand clutched my thigh, where the marks from the handcuffs were still visible. My fingers were throbbing with pain, and with every passing minute, the sensation grew stronger. I couldn't understand how this had happened. How had I, a simple woman, just sitting in a park, ended up here? After I was registered, the admission process began immediately. My name, personal details, photograph. All these procedures were soulless, automatic. It was as if they were trying to remind me that I was no longer a human being, that I was just another unit in their system that needed to be sorted, punished, and sent on. "Raise your hands," one of the officers ordered as I was being photographed. "Yes, that's it." His voice sounded emotionless, as if it were just a normal part of his job, not the life of a suffering human being. I stood in front of the camera, and it seemed to me that every movement of my lips and every movement of my fingers in the photograph would leave an indelible mark on my soul. The feeling of humiliation was simply unbearable. How could I be in this situation? I hadn't done anything. I was just sitting in a park. I opened a book. Yes, I was reading. That was all I did. And yet, I was here, in this cage. Feelings of helplessness and anger mixed together, and my fingers clenched tightly on my knees. My skin felt heavy from the constant touch of the metal handcuffs. There, in that small cell with flashing lights, I realized one thing. This world is unfair, and fighting it is the only way. I can't ignore this. I wasn't just a victim. I was part of a larger mechanism, a mechanism that cannot exist as long as people remain silent, as long as we don't resist. I replayed everything that had happened in my head. Every word, every glance, as if each one was directed at me, and not just at that moment. They didn't see me as a person, but as something to be humiliated. It was hard to breathe. I couldn't understand why me. Why was I chosen for this scene? Maybe I wasn't right for them? Was it because of my dark skin that I was already suspicious? The feeling of powerlessness grew. The police station was crowded, but to me it felt empty and cold. I wasn't here for any real reason. They never explained why I was suspicious. All these questions and demands seemed so absurd. I looked at the shelves, the boxes, the people in the other cells, and I realized that I was here, and this wasn't just a detention. It was part of something bigger. The first hours I spent in that cell seemed like an eternity. My mind couldn't stop thinking about one thing. I suffered from being humiliated, from not being allowed to leave this place in peace. Every time I heard someone approaching my cell, I held my breath, hoping that this would be the moment when I would be released. But every time, the door remained closed. Then, news came. As soon as I was released on bail, I heard that the officers who arrested me had filed a lawsuit. They accused me of resisting and obstructing, but what did that really mean? How could I have resisted when I was just sitting on a bench answering their questions? But now I had to face reality, this profound injustice, and I couldn't leave it at that. I knew the fight was just beginning. As I was leaving the station, I ran into Marissa, a colleague who was so worried about me that she came even though it was late. She looked at me, her face full of concern. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly as we got into her car. I nodded, even though I was a storm of emotions that had not yet found an outlet. "I'll fight," I replied, though my voice was almost hopeless. "This isn't just a one-off. I won't let it go." Marissa just looked at me, understanding that this wasn't just a one-time thing. This was a fight for something bigger than my personal dignity. This was a fight for everyone who was going through something similar and who might not have the strength to speak up. I knew that the next few weeks would be a test, but now I was ready for it. All those procedures, all those stares, they only made me stronger. I was ready. When I was released on bail, it felt like I had stepped out of a cramped cage, but my soul was still in that cold police station. I was physically free, but the feelings of injustice and anger remained. What next? What should I do with this hurt, with what had happened to me, and most importantly, with what I could do for others who found themselves in the same situation? It wasn't just about me, it was about a struggle that seemed endless. And I decided that I would fight. Marissa was my biggest supporter. She helped me stay strong when my heart was breaking from the humiliation. She never judged me, but her worried look told me that this wasn't the end. She was my friend, but also my partner in this fight. "Are you ready for this?" she asked as we sat in her car on the way back from the station. I knew the question wasn't about whether I could win the case. It was about whether I could handle all the pressure I knew was coming. I looked at her, feeling my heart start to beat a little faster. I was ready. I had to be ready. "Yes, I'll fight, Marissa. This isn't just my fight. I have to do this for everyone who's going through the same thing, and even for those who are too afraid to speak up. We have to change this system." She nodded, but I could see in her face that it was going to be hard. Everyone around me was telling me to drop it, that it was too big of a risk for my career, that my reputation as a lawyer could be damaged. But how could I remain silent when I knew that every day other people were going through what I had gone through? I couldn't let this situation become just another statistic. I immediately began preparing for the next steps. My goal was clear. I didn't just want to win the case. I wanted to bring not only the officers to justice, but the entire system that allows such things to happen. I knew it wouldn't be easy. This fight required more than just legal knowledge. It was a test of my morality, my resilience, my ability to remain steadfast in the face of the power that stood against me. Marissa and I worked tirelessly. Every day, I would come home and immediately sit down at my desk. I pored over documents, looking for precedents that could help my case. I spent hours studying cases where officers had used violence, looking for even the smallest details that could undermine their arguments. I was determined. I knew that this case could be decisive for many people, even if no one else realized it. We weren't just working on the case itself. I was actively in touch with local activists and organizations fighting for human rights. They supported me, inspired me, and gave me hope. I started speaking at local meetings, where I shared my story. Everyone knew I was a lawyer, but no one knew why I had become such an activist. Now they knew that I couldn't stay silent. No matter how hard I tried to leave it in the past, the moments when I felt broken and humiliated still haunted me. It was difficult to get through each day when I remembered how helpless I felt sitting in that cell, feeling the system crushing me. But it was a pain I couldn't allow myself to forget. I had to use it to change things. Then one day, as I was waiting in line to meet with my lawyers, my attorney called. He told me that the officers who had arrested me had filed a lawsuit against me. This came as no surprise. I knew this was standard practice for those who didn't want to admit their guilt. But what struck me was another piece of news. The same officers I was going to prosecute were involved in another case, and I had been assigned as the judge for one of their cases. It was a moment when it felt like the whole world was against me. I realized that this was not just a coincidence. It was an opportunity not only to stand up to them in court, but to become the person who could change the system from within. At first, I was shocked. How could I be a judge in a case where these same officers were the defendants? It was a challenge. And even the thought of it filled me with overwhelming anger and pain. But then I realized, this was a chance for real justice. I had to be the one to show that even a system that leads to cases like this can be changed. I couldn't refuse. It was more than just a case. It was an opportunity to define what justice is. When I found out that I had been assigned to a case where the defendants were the very officers who had arrested me, I felt my blood run cold. My first reaction was shock. This couldn't be a coincidence, and in that moment, I knew it was an opportunity. It was fate giving me the chance to not only demand justice for myself, but to change something in the system. These two officers were trying to hold on to their positions, their power, and I was there to restore balance. My head was spinning. How could I handle this case and remain objective? How could I look into the eyes of people who, I knew, had humiliated me without hesitation? How could I leave my emotions outside the courtroom when every glance they gave me reminded me of the moment when they illegally handcuffed me? But I knew one thing. This was my chance to set a real precedent for change. On the first day of the hearing, when I walked into the courtroom, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I felt as if every move, every word would have consequences not only for this case, but for my soul. I couldn't allow myself to show any weakness. I had to be strong not only for myself, but for all those I imagined in my mind. Those who suffer from discrimination, those who suffer from a system that does not see their suffering. The police officers sitting in the dock looked strange. They had been so confident just a few months ago when they arrested me for no reason. But now, as I stood at the podium, everything had changed. I saw fear in their eyes, not just because they were standing before a judge, but because they realized they were in the hands of someone they had humiliated. Officer Carter and his partner Daniel sat quietly, their shoulders hunched, their eyes avoiding mine. I could feel my heart beating faster, but I didn't let myself lose focus. The entire courtroom was silent. All that mattered at that moment was the truth. I began to listen to the questioning, and every word, every piece of evidence they presented, made me feel how difficult it would be for them to prove their innocence. The hearing began with the prosecutor presenting witnesses, including people who had been subjected to violence by officers in other cases. They all told similar stories, stories of abuse of power, of how police officers violate their duties, and how this leaves people defenseless. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a great battle for justice, and every word from the prosecutor was an important step toward victory. But when the defense began its closing arguments, I realized that this was not going to be a routine court hearing. Their arguments were so weak that it seemed more like an attempt to simply dismiss the charges. The officer's defense attorney tried to manipulate the facts, justifying every wrong decision they had made, every step that had broken the law. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I couldn't allow their manipulation to succeed. I looked at these people and knew that they would never put themselves in the shoes of those they had humiliated. They would never understand what it was like to be the target of a system that works against you, not for you. With every word from the prosecutor, with every confirmation from the witnesses, I felt more and more confident. I knew that this wasn't just a hearing. This was my chance to show that even a system designed to protect can be unfair and disrespectful to those it is supposed to protect. After the break, I returned to the courtroom and saw them, the officers sitting on the bench, as if they were sure that this time they would fool everyone again. But I was ready for that. I looked at them and didn't take my eyes off them. They must have known that I was not there to seek revenge, but to demand justice and show them that this time they would not escape accountability. They looked at me with new eyes, and I could see it. It wasn't a look of contempt or aggression. It was a look that showed some confusion. They knew they weren't just playing with my life. This time, they were playing with a system they had tried to break, but now it was working for me. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. It was more than just a hearing. It was a real battle for dignity, for justice, so that no one could cheat the system and escape punishment for their actions. Everyone who came knew that this case was not about two officers. It was about something much more important. As a judge, I was on the front lines of the fight to ensure that these charges did not remain empty words. I had prepared for this moment in advance. I studied every argument, every piece of evidence. My role was not only to stand up against the officers who had broken the law, but also to do everything possible to ensure that this would be a lesson for everyone. I could not allow this to happen again, to allow a system that is supposed to serve the people to continue to work for those who abuse their position. The courtroom fell silent again when I stepped up to the podium. Today, I am not just a judge. Today, I am a voice for those who have no voice. It was a moment when I had to put aside all emotion and do my job with cold determination. But deep down, I knew that this moment was important not only for me, but for every person who had ever been a victim of injustice. This hearing has been convened to decide the case of two officers accused of excessive use of force. We cannot allow people who are supposed to protect citizens to abuse their power. I began my decision, my voice firm, but I felt every word. The hearing was over, and now it was time to announce the verdict. The room was tense, and everyone's eyes were on me. I could see that both officers were sitting in the same position as when they were first arrested. I could see the fear in their eyes. But it wasn't just fear of the court. It was fear that they would finally be held accountable for their actions. I stared at them, trying to see some sign of remorse. But no one admitted their mistake. They stood proudly, even now, when their actions had gone unpunished. They didn't understand why I couldn't just forgive them. After all, in their minds, it was just a bad day at work. But I saw that their actions were part of something bigger, a systemic injustice that cannot go unnoticed. You violated your duties. You abused your power. You humiliated a person who just wanted to enjoy their day, I said calmly, but every word carried the weight of justice. Your actions not only harmed one individual, they undermined the trust in the system you represent. I put down my notes and looked at them. My hand was holding the judge's gavel, but my thoughts were clear. This wasn't just a decision, it was a signal to everyone. To those who think they can avoid responsibility because of their uniform or connections. Officers Carter and Daniels, you are being punished for your actions. These are not just fines or short sentences, this is an important change. You will receive mandatory unpaid leave and additional training on human rights and ethics. Your names will remain in the archives as an example that when you break the law, even under the protection of your uniform, you will be held accountable. This decision is also a warning to those who work in the system. We will not tolerate abuse, I announced. The courtroom fell silent. This was not just punishment. It was a chance for change. When I banged the gavel, I felt not only myself but the entire courtroom breathe a sigh of relief. This was not just a verdict for these two men. It was a verdict for the system that allows abuse. The officers left the courtroom, and I saw their faces change. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at their future. They already understood that this case would be an important milestone in their careers and lives. They couldn't escape it, no matter how hard they tried. The courtroom emptied. I remained standing before the bench, looking around for the people who had come to support me. And when I saw them, ordinary people with different stories, I felt that it had been the right decision. That was the moment when I realized that my struggle had not been in vain. I realized that although the road had been difficult, it had been meaningful. Already in the car on the way home, I remembered all those moments when I was in the cell, when I thought that nothing would change. But now I knew that change was possible. And this was only the first victory. It was more than a personal victory. It was a victory for justice for all of us. We all had the right to equality, to dignity. And I was ready to fight for it to the end.